Great. We're going to get started. So I can officially welcome everyone. Today we're going to have a presentation from Conor Eastment, a prospective PhD student who's been working at the Grasslands node in the Drakensberg at the Cathedral Peak research infrastructure platform. Let me give a brief introduction to Conor. He forwarded his CV to me, and I learned a lot about him that I didn't know, and some very interesting things. Conor is an avid adventurer and an expedition leader. One of the things he's done is cycle from Cape Town to Malawi to raise money for charity. One of his latest adventures includes a 1,800 kilometer cycling and trekking trip all the way from the roof of the Indochina to northern Vietnam and northern Thailand's highest mountain peak. Conor is a nature lover, and he has a passion for global change issues, and his work has varied from interest in getting electric vehicles to be sold, electric motorcycles, and he's done a lot of work with human wildlife, promoting the flourishing of humans and wildlife together. Some work in Gabon, and his MSc research involved looking at interactions between fire and woody vegetation in Namibia. Conor came to us through our associate professor, Mariska Tobias, who we're very happy to have at our node. She's contributed so much there. She is the professor in systems ecology and conservation at Utrecht University, and she's a research associate at SAEON and the Nelson Mandela University. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and I'm looking forward to Conor's research. He's going to be talking on, his title is Investigating the Interactive Effect of Warming and Fire on Above and Below Ground Dynamics in Temperate Drakensberg Grasslands. Thanks, Conor, and over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Paul, for that great introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Conor. And today I'm going to talk about the first year and a half of my 4-year PhD, which is looking at the effects of fire and warming in temperate montane grassland diversity and productivity. And I'm very privileged and lucky to be supported by a great team at Utrecht University, at the SAEON Grasslands node, and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And the project that I'm working on is part of a broader project that's looking at biodiversity and fire and carbon storage across South Africa. And there's another PhD also working on this project that is led by Mariska Tobias, and that other PhD is Michelle Lowe, who's looking at land use and land cover change at a bigger scale, basically. And yeah, we're very lucky to be funded by the Dutch Research Council, operating in South Africa. So looking forward to sharing some of this work with you. Just to give a little bit of an overview of the topics we'll cover today, just a little bit of a background, grassland conservation, my introduction to fire ecology, which Paul has already alluded to. I'm going to focus mostly on point 3, which is kind of my chapter 1 for the PhD, and then speaking a little bit about some of the fieldwork I've done, point 4, and also the plan for fieldwork in the upcoming season. And yeah, I think it's a really nice opportunity at this stage of a PhD to share where I'm at, but also to get some input on how things are currently framed, any ideas and thoughts moving forward, collaborations, etc. So looking forward to sharing, and yeah, please do post questions in the comments, or yeah, looking forward to hearing comments at the end as well. So like I said, just a bit of a personal anecdote here. Basically, my introduction to fire ecology began in 2019 during my master's research, where as part of a collaborative team with paleoecologists and land use change scientists, we looked at how woody vegetation has changed over different timescales in Bwabwata National Park. And my specific piece of research used repeat photography, which is what you can see in this top row over here, to understand how woody vegetation has changed in the park over 20 years in relation to rainfall, land use, and other factors. And what we found was a major increase in woody vegetation change. This is an extreme example that I'm showing you in this top photo. And when we looked at the same sites as these repeat photo sites with remote sensing, what you can see on the bottom row is from left to right, a reduction in the white dots, which represent grassland. So generally speaking, we were finding this bush encroachment trend across the park. And that was related to a variety of factors, but some of them were global in the sense of climate change and carbon dioxide fertilization. But fire offered this this management tool, a local and fairly accessible management tool to basically manage this change. And so it really just, this master's was a great opportunity to just see the power of fire management basically. And also this need for grassland conservation. If we zoom out a little bit, you can see in the red square where that master's research took place. And now if we just look at a continental scale, in green over here, we can see a lot of green, across over here, we can see a lot of green. And that basically represents an increase in woody cover across the continent. There's some red, but it's mostly an increase in green. And that's associated with a variety of factors, like I said, but one of the factors of interest is this decline in burnt area, basically, despite the fact that a large portion of these areas require fire as a natural part of the ecosystem. And so it's essentially a bit of a shrinking in the grassland space because of bush encroachment. And again, fire management seems to be this tool that we're not really using as much as we could. And also, important to mention that it's not just the use of fire, it's also understanding exactly how to use it. And that's what I think is really interesting from a fire ecology point of view, because when we have this shrinking grassland, there's a variety of ecosystem services that I've kind of pointed out at the bottom here that are lost as a result. We have a high rate of soil erosion, a decreased soil carbon, which is also associated with an increase in the amount of carbon stored in woody vegetation, which is prone to wildfires. There's an associated loss in biodiversity in terms of your lack of heterogeneity in the vegetation structure. A lot of our grasslands are water strategic areas. And so we have a decline in water security. And with the thickening of bush, generally speaking, we also have a decline in tourism value. So this loss of grassland is of concern. And there's initiatives that are purported as restoration, which in fact could even sort of exacerbate this shrinking grassland situation. So what I have over here is a map that shows the African Forest Restoration Initiative and the countries that have pledged towards this initiative, where they are aiming to restore land by reforesting the land. And obviously in a forest area that is appropriate. But what is of concern for grassland here is that we have over 10 African countries who have committed to either reforesting more land than is forest in their country, or as you can see in the case of Namibia and some of our Saharan countries in Africa, a pledge to forest space that is really not supposed to be forest. And so what we have over this space is 100 million hectares of either savanna or grassland or other non-forest ecosystems that are going to be degraded by restoration initiatives. And I think what this shows is that there's this need to not only communicate better the services and the functioning that we receive from grassland, but also to make sure that our science is solid and that we have a lot of good information to feed that communication. So one of the best places to do this research and understand what grasslands have to offer is intact ecosystems. And one of the most intact open grasslands in the world is in South Africa, the uKhahlamba Drakensberg montane grassland, or the temperate montane grassland, which is where our study took place, or is taking place. It's a center of plant endemism, so there's 227 endemic angiosperms, 180 of those are forbs. So the majority of species richness or diversity in this system is from the forb component, so your herby species that you can see in this bottom left here. And over 90% of the biomass is grassland, which is what you can see on that lower section of the berg over here. And what is really important in this ecosystem is that fire is a natural disturbance regime that has occurred in the ecosystem for millennia, from before humans were dominating the ecosystem. And this is the case because over winter we have really cold, dry, and frosty conditions that basically really dry up the biomass. And then in the summer period, we have the summer sort of storms coming through with the lightning, and that combination of really dry vegetation with lightning at the beginning of summer has kept up a natural fire disturbance regime, basically. And also coincides with a really productive system that has had to survive because, has had to survive by basically resprouting after fire. So a lot of the important dynamics of the grassland occur below ground. And so because of the fact that we have human development in these areas now, we can't really let large wildfires run through the system. So we have conservation-based fire management that tries to mimic this natural disturbance regime as best possible. And we do this because there's been a lot of amazing research, particularly in this area, that has shown us that through appropriate fire management, we increase plant basal cover, which reduces soil erosion, which also allows the Drakensberg to continue to supply, I think, around 14% of South Africa's water. As we said, it's a high level of endemic species in the area that are maintained by this natural disturbance regime. And there's also increased grazing quality for indigenous fauna that arises because of this fire management process. But we know with climate change that we're going to have hotter temperatures. Seasonality is becoming an issue. Our levels of precipitation are varying quite widely. So we'll have some very wet years, some very dry years. And obviously, these are very important dynamics to understand in terms of continuing appropriate fire management. And so this is the, broadly speaking, overarching research question of the PhD. And it's trying to understand how conservation management, the conservation management practice of fire management is going to be impacted by climate change. And what that means for the various ecosystem services that this ecosystem provides for us. And one of the best ways to really understand how change is happening in an ecosystem is through long-term ecological research. One of South Africa's proudest spaces for long-term ecological research is the Cathedral Peak research area. So the first half of my project will utilize a mesocosm style approach, which will be based on the, has been based on the Brotherton fire trial. What you can see over here is different 25 square meter blocks in the trial here in winter and over here in summer. And what's important to see here is just that each square looks really different. So we have some green, we have some orange, we have some fairly white, and all of these represent different fire treatments from a seasonal and a frequency point of view that create a different grassland. And that different grassland has different properties in terms of diversity and productivity. The second half of the PhD will look at the catchment management experiment that exists in Cathedral Peak area. What you can see in yellow here is the different catchments that are labeled from 1 to 15. Not all 15 of these catchments are, as I understand it, in action, if you want to put it like that. But I think what's also important at this stage, again, is just to look at the different properties from a color point of view that you can see within each catchment here. representing the different fire histories, afforestation histories, and also land management practices that have taken place across these catchments, really helping us understand how different management approaches result in different diversity and productivity. And this is all maintained by SAEON and Esimvelo. So it's really amazing to, again, be able to work in this space and also build on the amazing work that has already been done. Yeah. So like I said, the first half is a mesocosm experiment. This is field work that I've completed for the most part at this stage. This is kind of my first paper or chapter, if you want to call it. And basically the idea is to understand how experimental warming, to implement the experimental warming, and to understand how that warming interacts with fire, specifically spring burn fire, and its frequencies to change the microclimate, the phytomass, and the diversity of the grassland. And on the left-hand side over here, you can see what that experimental warming chamber looks like. Each of those chambers is paired with a control site, and that's where we measure these 3 different parameters. And then just to have an idea of the experimental setup over here, we've got, we will be focusing, or we have focused on 4 different fire frequency treatments. So in blue, you can see there's a no-burn, annual, biennial, and quinquennial. So basically every once a year, every 2 years, or every 5 years, a fire comes through the system. And then across those fire treatments, we have 4 replications, each of them with a pairing. So there's a total of 32 sites that we've used for this first paper. And if we start to look at the microclimate results, which are based on these beautiful instruments here called the TMS logger, we've got in the green, there's a section of the instrument that fits underground and provides soil moisture and temperature readings. And then just above the surface, we have another temperature logger. And then 15 centimeters above the ground, we have air temperature. And these instruments have been in situ for over a year now. So we're starting to really get into the response of the microclimate. And the first point to note is that over the summer period, which is obviously when we would have our maximum temperatures, like our heat wave, climate change style events, we can see in the red line for air, soil, and surface temperature that we have at least a 1 degree Celsius increase. For soil temperature, in air temperature, it's a little bit more. It's in the order of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius hotter at the maximum heat of the day. And surface temperature is just below 1 degree Celsius, actually. And then if we look at soil moisture over the year, over here, we can see that there's a consistently lower soil moisture level in the experimentally warmed plots. And so essentially we can, this is just understanding what effect we are measuring. We're focusing on the summer temperatures, obviously, because if we're thinking about what climate change is going to do to grassland in the future, a lot of the concern is around heat waves. And then I suppose with the soil moisture being lower here, we would be reenacting a sort of El Nino drought style year. So trying really to understand what phytomass and diversity would do under those circumstances. And I think above and beyond kind of setting the experimental warming stage, there's also some interesting results that are coming through in the microclimate response to these fire and warming treatments. And I think they highlight the fact that vegetation can act as a mediating role with climatic change because of this boundary layer effect that we can often see as a result of vegetation. Our macro scale climate change doesn't always respond or mean direct changes in the microclimate because of the role that shading and humidity, etc., of different plant environments play in the microclimate. So one way of looking at that in our data here is basically looking at how soil moisture differs across the fire treatments here on the x-axis, and then the warming treatments that are colored. And what you can see consistently across the fire treatments is that all of the warming plots have lower soil moisture, which makes sense. But what's interesting as well is that the more frequently burnt sites, the annual and the biennial, have a lower soil moisture in general than the less frequently burnt sites, because they are removing the vegetation on a more frequent basis and exposing the soil to more direct radiation. And so basically, it's just important to understand that the different grassland types have different mediating roles and different effects on microclimate. And that microclimate is one of the more direct ways to understand the effect of climate change on our vegetation. From a phytomass point of view, we have found that, as you can see in the red over here, there's a consistently higher level of phytomass or vegetation in the warming plots. And that obviously in the protected plots, there's consistently higher levels of phytomass, which kind of explains that mediating role that we were just looking at. But it's obviously important to point out here that this is not a measure of productivity necessarily, because the annual burnt plots, this is the amount of phytomass that they have after 1 year of growth, if you want to put it like that. So they almost, you should almost multiply the amount of phytomass here by 4 if we're going to speak kind of broadly to really understand productivity levels. But the point here is that warming increases the amount of above ground phytomass. And that has possible implications on fire severity. Obviously, if we have more phytomass above ground, we have more fuel load. And then again, linking it back to that mediating role of vegetation, we have a higher shading taking place. And that could have some implications on the ground layer plants that we find as well. So our species composition results based on the Levy Bridge survey method. So it's not a total area survey. It's a descending point method. So it's an idea of general species composition, not necessarily the best method to really look in detail at rarer species. So we're thinking, broadly speaking here, about species composition, the more common species. The survey found 35 species across all the warming and fire treatments. And when we try and unpack the differences between warming and control in terms of the species that are present in either of those treatments, what we can see is that there's a massive overlap in the middle of these circles. So this number here represents the amount of species that are present in both the warming and the control of this biennial fire treatment. And there's only 4 and 3 species in warming and control here that are unique to those warming treatments. And what we can see is that there's slightly more species in the annual and the biennial burns as compared to the quinquennial and the protected, which kind of makes sense in the other research that has been done in this area. But if we're to think about what the effect of warming is on species composition here, there's not a major difference really happening. There is slightly more species in the warming side, but it's not something that seems really significant. So we would say that there's a high level of nestedness, basically, a large number of shared species between control and warming, suggesting a low turnover, and also suggesting a fairly small effect of the chambers so far on species composition. And I think what's really interesting is when we compare this to fire over here. So here we're looking at the same species composition or species presence between fire treatments. So here we have annual and biennial. We have 18 shared species, but 7 unique to annual, 4 unique to biennial. If we compare annual and protected, there's 12 unique to annual, 5 unique to protected. And so essentially this middle overlap circle area representing nestedness is substantially smaller when we compare fire treatments. So there's a higher level of turnover between fire treatments compared to warming treatments. And so we would say that at this point in time, especially for these dominant species that we were able to detect, fire is influencing species composition more than warming. And so these results do kind of suggest some support for other papers by Jewett et al., for example, which have said that the C4 grasslands of the Drakensberg are largely immune or quite resilient to climate change. And so it's a kind of a positive result, I would say, in the sense of giving us some hope. And so that was based on what species occur in which treatments. And now if we start to look at what the abundance of different species are across these treatments, we start to see some more trends. Still no major movements because of warming, but what we can see in this top graph over here is the abundance of C4 grasses, which are 8 of the 35 species that were found. And you can see that they dominate all the fire treatments, with the lowest abundance being 50 in annual, and the highest abundance being 90% of the plot covered by C4 graminoids in the biennial treatment that you can see on this bottom axis here. And this is these intermediate fire frequencies that have the highest levels of C4 graminoids. While there is some difference, maybe in the biennial treatment here between control and warming, it's not really anything major at this point. I think the biggest difference between control and warming in terms of relative abundance is in the dicot functional group. So similar to our forbs, we can obviously see that in the annual plot where there's more sun hitting the ground layer, we have a higher abundance of dicots. But what's interesting is that in the biennial, quinquennial, and protected plots, there's a consistently higher abundance of dicot species in the warming plots. And so there seems to be an effect of warming on the abundance of dicots, which I'll get into a little bit now. But the other result I think that is important to point out is that the amount of bare ground in quinquennial and protected is substantially higher. And this just speaks to that role of frequent fire in refreshing the system. Preventing bare ground is something that we generally want to do because it prevents soil erosion, it increases plant basal cover spread, and obviously those are sort of ecosystem functioning characteristics that provide ecosystem services like soil carbon, etc. But in terms of this higher dicot abundance in the warming plots, if you look at more specifically the different species that might be responsible for this higher abundance, we definitely see an increase in Anthropogenic herbaceum. So this is a herb species that occurs generally in quite low abundance across the Brotherton Plateau, but for some reason seems to be enjoying the warming effect of the chamber. It would be really interesting to know. I'm not a botanist, so I haven't quite figured out exactly why that is the case at this point, but they seem to be doing quite well in the warming chamber. In this one in particular, there's a 20% dominance of the herb or the dicot, as opposed to 2% in the control plot. So this kind of indicates that there might be some concern in increasing dominance in the warming chambers. But if we look at an index that shows us the level of dominance, this one's called the Berger-Parker index, which is basically calculated by dividing the number of individuals in the most abundant species by the total individuals present. We see that actually the warming in red here have consistently lower index scores. So basically the higher the index score is here, the more dominated that plot is by one particular species. There's not much of a difference in the annual, but there's a consistently higher level of control dominance occurring here. Now we do have quite a big spread in the protected, which probably is represented by plots like this. But if we are to look at, broadly speaking, the trend here is that actually warming is less dominated by the control. And so if we were to do more in-depth species composition studies, we might find that this increase in dicot abundance is hopefully as a result of diversity and not the abundance of one species. But unfortunately, our species composition surveys can't say that for certain at this stage. But generally speaking, again, I think some support for the idea of rather resilient C4 grasslands. So speaking of resilience, we're moving into kind of the second chapter of my work at the moment. I thought it'd be really interesting to show this pano, the sequence of photos taken last year in one of the catchments. We can see from left to right, basically just before the burn over here. And then straight afterwards, you can see all above ground biomass totally removed. And then just 4 weeks later, we have a really verdant green happening here. And so again, I think this pano shows a lot of things. I think it's quite nice to look at, but generally speaking, I think for me, what it shows is that these grasslands are a really resilient system, which has evolved to respond to this really intense fire disturbance regime over millennia. Because of the nature of the mountainous environment, has probably also had a lot of climatic change happen over that period of time. And so it's a system that has evolved to basically allow its above ground biomass to be removed by having a lot of things happening below ground. And so the idea behind my second chapter is to really start to understand these above below ground linkages. And so this is fieldwork that I've completed, but I'm still getting kind of into the data. But to just give you an idea, we are measuring the productivity based on the seasonal accumulation of biomass with the in-growth core method that we've placed across the fire and the warming treatments on the plateau that I've showed you already. Over here, you can see the in-growth core method. And so basically the idea is that over one growth season, we have roots growing into that core. And then that kind of represents the amount of below ground biomass that can build up in one season. And then we also are understanding soil carbon. We've sampled soil carbon and nitrogen in these treatments as well. And the idea for this chapter is to compare those varying levels of productivity to the community weighted means traits that exist in the plots. So we've sampled a variety of traits, which I won't go into now, but they're listed here. And basically, we've done this by taking out 50 to 60 of the dominant plants around the outside of the Brotherton trial. And then based on the trait characteristics of those plants, we will try to see if they are associated with particular levels of productivity across the warming treatments in the trial. So that's just quickly speaking. I know there's a lot there, but that's just quickly speaking kind of the broad structure of the chapter. And then just to give you some kind of anecdotes from that fieldwork, I think are quite interesting. So obviously we needed to dig up some plants, and in that process, we're able to get a better understanding of the soil profile and the rooting profile in this area. And what you can see here over about 25 centimeters depth, that about halfway, there's this really solid line where the strong rooting, the really dense fine root network that occurs in the top profile stops because of a more clay-like soil. And so we can really see that the majority of below ground biomass really occurs in that first piece of the profile. And when you dig up the different plants, you can see that the rooting goes laterally, and as opposed to straight down, it's spreading sideways. And so I think that's just an interesting thing to understand in terms of looking at below ground productivity, but also the different effects of these fire and warming treatments on this lateral root spread that's happening. So one of the traits that we looked at across those 60 dominant forbs and grasses was the root mass fraction. And I'm just going to show you like a preliminary result right now. So for those who are not familiar with that term, it's basically a measure of the amount of below ground biomass relative to the total biomass present in a plant. So if it has a lot more biomass below ground as opposed to above ground, it's going to have a higher percentage root mass fraction. So what we can see here from a review study, which combined data, all these points here, all these circles here are different data points of root mass fraction across different ecosystem types. And if we look at the different grassland types within this study, we can see that montane and temperate grasslands, which are obviously the grasslands that we have in the Drakensberg, are some of the highest scoring root mass fraction grasslands. And that's really important, obviously, because this is again soil organic carbon that is safe from wildfires. It obviously gives us an indication of how much water retention we have, of the amount of soil erosion that might occur. And I think generally speaking, root mass fraction is something that is a good thing for those ecosystem functions. And I think one thing that's also interesting is that if we look at the African continent here, there's about maybe 7 grassland sites. I haven't looked at exactly which grassland type those are, but there's obviously a paucity of data that comes from the continent with regards to root mass fraction. So I think it's really nice to see the results that we've got so far, which basically show us that graminoids, the dominant graminoids on the Brotherton, are about 77%, have about a 77% average root mass fraction. And the forbs are quite a lot higher at about 88% root mass fraction. And so they really are up there with some of the highest levels of root mass fraction across global grasslands. Again, just showing the importance of maintaining these systems. And I think this picture quite nicely shows that from a forb point of view, just how different things look underground, basically. So this species over here is a hypoxis, and you can see it's the amount of above ground biomass, obviously in a 2D space, is quite small. Whereas if we look below ground, this is a really bulky, I don't think bulb is the exact terminology that I should use for this one, but a really bulky below ground component. And that's pretty consistent across a lot of these species here, which are hypoxis in this bottom section. And then over here, we have the Helichrysum species, which has also that really bulky below ground storage organ. And obviously, this type of morphology can explain why forbs have such a high root mass fraction. So that's quickly speaking a little bit of chapter 2, which is still being put together. But to kind of look into the future now, the plan for the next fieldwork season is to zoom out away from that mesocosm scale and look at the landscape scale now across the catchments, understanding similar metrics, so diversity and productivity metrics, but across topographical levels. So one of the big factors affecting species composition in the area is aspect and incoming radiation. So we want to understand how topography influences these metrics we're looking at. And the catchments also have an afforestation history. So basically what you can see over here on the left-hand side is that these are the 8 catchments that I'll be looking at. I've got 4 catchments that are green, which represent your conservation style managed grasslands with most of the time biennial burns, although there are some different characteristics across these catchments. And those will be compared, of course, to the afforested catchments in blue, which are now trying to be restored through fire management and have varying levels of fire frequencies as well. And then we will also compare those catchments to the woody encroached and fire protected catchment over here, just to basically begin to understand how these different metrics of diversity and productivity differ across landscape histories. And then just quickly, the sampling protocol. So over here we have the 3 of the 8 different catchments that I'll be looking at. And the idea is to have these 4 plots in each catchment. And again, these 4 plots are chosen to kind of represent aspect, elevation. So across an altitudinal gradient, how do we see changes in these metrics? And there's also been a PhD just published by Lindor Dlamini. He's a postdoc at the Grasslands node now. And he has some amazing, he's done some amazing work in the catchments. I would definitely recommend having a look at his PhD, and I think some papers coming up. But the idea is to try and see if we can pair some of Lindor's carbon data with this species composition, microclimate, and phytomass data across these catchments. And like I said, that's the plan for the coming fieldwork season. But I've placed these amazing microclimate instruments in situ already, and they're sitting there gathering data for me at the moment. So you can see over here, this is one of them in situ at the top of one of the catchments. So yeah, that pretty much covers everything I have to say for now. So thanks very much for listening. I hope it was informative and interesting in some way. And yeah, I just want to again give thanks to the funders and the hosts, to the UKZN field assistants, Roy, Tando, and Tandi for all of their help making this possible and keeping me company in the field. And then also to the SAEON Grasslands node for being amazing hosts and for providing amazing logistical support. And then also to Ezembelo and the SAEON Famous node. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Conor. That was great.
Cool. Yeah.
It's so good to see how your PhD narrative is forming, and I think you've got some really solid data to work on. And I'm looking forward to seeing how that all comes together, all of those chapters. And the story sounds great. I'd like to open the floor for any questions. We haven't had any questions in the chat, but if anyone would like to pop a question there for Conor or comment, feel free to do that. Otherwise, feel free to put your hand up and unmute and ask a question or contribute some ideas towards Conor's research. We are also fortunate to have Conor's primary supervisor here, Mariska Tibiest. So any hard questions, we can just reflect to Mariska as well. So feel free to ask as many hard questions as you want.
Can I ask this question to Conor? Oh, sorry, somebody else was.
Sorry, Mariska, go for it.
Yeah, there was also somebody else, but no, I just wanted to make I wanted to ask you about the beautiful slide you showed with the species composition effects on the warming versus the fire. Did you take into account the duration of the treatment effect? So the fire effects have been going on for like 4 decades. The warming effect, I don't think you mentioned it. Huh? So it's been going on now for, was it 7 years?
Yeah, no, so thanks, Mariska. I think that's also a really important point. I did include it in the text there. So I think the fire experiments have been in place for almost 50 years now. Paul can definitely correct me, but it's somewhere around that amount of time. Whereas the warming has only been there since 2017.
Yeah, I think 7 years is quite a decent amount of time to start change, but I think maybe not as much as you would expect from the fire.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's also been interesting in our discussions is also the process of sampling species composition. I think is also important to really, if there is any effect happening now, to really adopt the right sampling protocol to pick that up. If that is in fact, if we're really trying to find that diversity effect. Yeah, but it's an important sort of length of treatment for sure.
Thanks, Mariska. I see Tony has his hand up. Tony, would you like to unmute and go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. Very interesting talk. I was wondering about those soil moisture differences. They were pretty big, and how important they are for plant responses, because you didn't seem to see a massive change in productivity in phytomass. So it seems, I mean, I'm not sure how deep those sensors were measuring, but perhaps a lot of that soil moisture effect is just in the very upper layers, and it's evaporating off, especially after a fire, but it's probably not so important for the plants because it's at a higher, well, firstly in summer, they're probably not water limited for a lot of the summer. And then secondly, maybe they're getting water from deeper in the profile where the differences aren't as much. I was just wondering what you thought of that.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So I think, the soil moisture is measured at 15 centimeters depth. So, and from I didn't use methods that are perfect for understanding rooting depth, but the rooting depth goes definitely deeper than that. So it's definitely possible that deeper down, actually, there is more of a deposit of soil moisture, as you've pointed out. I think the other thing to think of is also, like you're saying, these are they're pretty mesic, quite wet systems in general. So you know, the amount of soil moisture might not be such a limiting factor, really. Like we might have to see quite a big drought to see soil moisture driving some of these metrics. And I think that's also like kind of one of the plans to move forward is this idea of the R star. I think David Tillman's like threshold values, basically. It's not impossible that we haven't passed that threshold value for soil moisture in the systems.
Thanks, Conor. I don't see any other hands raised. Oh, Lindo, you are free to unmute and pop your question.
Hi, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Lindo. We can.
Okay. Thank you for a great talk, Conor. Like Paul said, it's a really neat story. Maybe I missed it, but I'm trying to link some of your findings to work around soil carbon. So the first one is you show that there is a lot of background in the protected or no fire. Do you have an idea of why is that? I'll assume there is more aerial cover there. Yeah, maybe I didn't understand that. But the second question is, in terms of the forbs, they have more contribution below ground. So they have more storage below ground. Do you have an idea of to what an extent do they contribute to abundance or phytomass, so that we can think about the overall contribution to the carbon stocks in the soil from the forbs? Maybe, yeah, I'm not sure if my question is clear.
Yeah, hi, Lindo. Two questions, I guess, right? I'll try answer the first one. So if I understand you correctly, you were just wondering about the link between soil carbon and then the comments about there being more bare ground. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
So yeah, I mean, I think my general understanding here, and I think the general point is that fire encourages a productive system. So if we have less frequently burnt grassland, there's less spreading of the grass layer, basically, because the grass is able to grow out and kind of shade itself out, and then some of it dies out, some of it sticks around. But generally speaking, there's not that refresh that comes from a fire layer, as we saw in that panel. You know, 4 weeks after a fire, you have really vigorous grass, basically. So the less frequently burned sites have more bare ground because they don't have that like refresh, if you want to put it colloquially, that the fire provides. And so the link to carbon or soil carbon there, which is definitely something that you know more about than me, but my understanding then is that obviously if we have a less productive grass layer, there's going to be less rooting that happens. And then obviously, if you look at, or even, I'm sure if you break it down into the different categories of soil carbon, there might be differences. But if we were to look at soil carbon in general, I think the assumption is that a more vigorous grass board that's spreading more often because of frequent fire is probably going to have a higher level of soil carbon. And then I think that's why it would be nice to pair this information with some of your soil carbon data in the catchments, because I think if I remember correctly, you found more soil carbon in these frequently burnt sites. So it's a nice opportunity to link some of these mechanisms, I think. Yeah, so And then your second, I don't know if you have anything to say, just jump in. But your second comment, I wasn't sure I understood it 100%. But basically, you were wondering about how abundant forbs are and their contribution to above ground phytomass, you say?
Yes. So I'm not above ground. So I'm thinking you showed that the forbs, the below ground is about 80% of the total plant, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm trying to look at in terms of the abundance of the forbs in one of those treatments and trying to see if we can then understand how much contribution they have on the carbon.
Yeah, sure, I get you. So I think it's definitely, you're raising an important point. Just because one individual plant has a higher level of below ground biomass doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to correlate to an overall more productive space, because obviously if that forb isn't very abundant, then it's just going to be the kind of once off. And that root mass fraction information is based off of obviously individuals. So considering the fact that grass species are more dominant, even though they have less below ground or a lower root mass fraction, I'm not sure, but my guess is that they would be contributing more to kind of system level or landscape level soil carbon. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to think about.
Thanks, Conor and Lindo. Great questions. Dave in the chat says, great work and great presentation, Conor.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave.
Right, if we don't have any more questions, I think we can call it. Thank you so much, Conor, for taking the time to present to us. I was certainly enriched by the presentation and discussion. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And yeah, thanks again, everyone, for listening. It's a good opportunity. Hope you all have a good day.
Cheers.